Hi, I'm Darren Chetty. I'm a teacher and a writer. I live in London and I was born in Swansea. I'm co-editor of the book Welsh Plural, which asks the question, what does it mean to imagine Welshness as both distinct and inclusive? In my chapter, I wrote partly about football, about supporting Wales, and about how football sometimes has been a place of hostility and divisiveness, and other times has been a place of unity and even of imagining a future more inclusive Wales. In this series, we're going to tell the story of the Black, Asian and racially minoritized footballers who've represented Wales over the years, starting right back in 1931 with Eddie Parris, the first black player to play for Wales, and tracing through the decades to the current national teams. In the process, I'm going to talk to some of the players who've played for Wales to find out their experiences, and also to some experts who can give us a sense of the social history, of the context in those times, what it was like for Black, Asian and racially minoritized populations in Wales. In this first episode, with the help of some people who've been researching his career, I'm on a quest to find out about Eddie Parris. Eddie was the first black man to play for Cymru, but he's not as well known as he should be. What we do know is that John Edward Parris was born near Chepstow in 1911 and played for Chepstow Town FC and a number of other clubs, including Bradford Park Avenue, Bournemouth and Boscombe, Luton Town and Northampton. And in 1931, he made his only appearance for Wales against Ireland in Belfast. To help get a better sense of what Wales was like at this time, I turned to historian Professor Martin Johns and Professor Uzo Iwobi, Chief Executive of Race Council Cymru.
Throughout the interwar period, Britain and Wales are undoubtedly racist societies. There was a belief in a racial hierarchy, which essentially meant that the lighter your skin was, the more civilised you were, the more intelligent you were. Britain is an overwhelmingly white country at this time. Populations or communities that are more diverse are very concentrated in specific places, particularly the ports. There was considerable hostility towards the black population within Britain, mostly from returning soldiers. They were worried about their future. They were looking for scapegoats in a racist era. Those scapegoats became the local black population.
In Cardiff, you would have had the Somali community, the Jewish community, some Nigerians who came through the sea, and, the Sudanese and some of the early traders, the merchant sea people, and of course the resident community. Many of them were mixed race and people were coming to support with the war efforts, etc.
Communities like the docks in Cardiff were looked down upon as places of violence, of crime, of prostitution. There was considerable concern across the UK about racial mixing. These attitudes are very powerful and would have shaped the daily experiences of anyone in Britain who wasn't white. I would argue that probably the vast majority of people in rural communities had never met anyone who wasn't white, which is why it's really striking that Eddie Parris was born and raised in a rural community. And that raises the question, had the family moved there to escape some of the more overt racism they might have faced in Newport or Cardiff communities that were more diverse.
When I arrived myself in '93, my children were the only black children in the entire school. So I can well imagine what kind of interactions he would have had to have.
Was the experience of someone black better where they were the only black person? Or was it better in a community where there was sort of mutual support, but also maybe race was more of a concern for white people?
To learn more about the community Eddie grew up in, I went to meet the secretary of Tydenham History Society and proud Chepstonian Liz McBride. Liz has a fantastic collection of photographs of Eddie that were gifted to her by Kathleen Stanley, a relative of Eddie's.
I became interested in Eddie when I discovered that A, he was born in Chepstow, and B, he was the first black player for Wales. But there wasn't much about him online or anywhere. Eddie was born in Pulmerich, which is just the other side of Chepstow, a mile the other side. He was the first child of Annie, who was white, and Jack, who was black, from Barbados.
Outside of Cardiff, I'm guessing there weren't that many mixed relationships that people were seeing. Do you get a sense of the area and how the family were received? Does that sort of show up in any of your research?
No. Everything I found out that the family were totally part of the community. Nobody seemed to sort of make any note of the fact that it was a mixed marriage, and you know, this is like 50 odd years or whatever before Windrush. So they're really sort of like trendsetters in a way, because, and like I said, everybody I know said how popular they were, how much Eddie was cheered when he came back to town.
He was a local celebrity.
He was a local hero, yes, yeah.
There's perhaps still a lack of public recognition of Eddie. However, there are those who are working to keep his memory alive within the community, such as Monmouthshire County Councillor Armand Watts.
Do you think you were quite rare in sort of being aware of him from quite young? When I've looked online, it seems like it's been quite recently that people have become more aware of Eddie. Is that the case?
I think so. I think it wasn't until I'd only really noticed that when I started to get more involved with Football Association of Wales and knew some of the players there, Robert Earnshaw, Danny Gabardon, I'd have conversations with them and they didn't know who he was, and I thought that was fascinating. So I'd go back and then interrogate my father about it, so I could go back and tell them about, you know, what the experience he's had watching Eddie play. And my dad would say he was a tenacious winger. He was a very direct footballer. So that's how I got to hear about Eddie, really was from my father.
So I found one newspaper article from 1933 that was talking, or I think it was a letter, and it talked about foreign players in the British game, and it mentions Eddie Parris as one of those players. What do you think about that description of him as a foreign player?
Well, he wasn't a foreign player because he was born here. So I think it's slightly racist because they're perceiving the fact that Eddie was black, that he couldn't possibly be British. But now our country is very diverse, and 1933 was a different time altogether. Whoever wrote that obviously couldn't appreciate that someone could be black and born in Britain.
Before the Second World War, football, at least, is you know, like the rest of the UK, is overwhelmingly white. You know, there are only 2 black players with any profile in the Football League before the Second World War, Eddie Parris and Jack Leslie.
I can imagine the sense of isolation and the sense of distance from other players he would have felt. Their experiences are different, your skin color's different, you're vividly there to be targeted when you score for good and when you don't, for hatred.
One of the photos that I received from Kathleen, she quite rightly pointed out that this is probably a Wales top rather than a club top because of the badge. And there he is playing for Wales against Ireland.
So that's just before the match in Belfast, 1931.
31, yeah. So...
wow. It's the first time I've seen that photo because I haven't seen it anymore.
Wow.
Eddie only gets a single cap playing for Wales in 1931. They play Ireland, they lose 4-0. He doesn't apparently have a very good game. So from a footballing perspective, it's maybe understandable that he was never selected. Again, you know, he'd had his chance and in some ways, you know, he'd blown it. But at another level, you know, he's still playing at a relatively high level. It's not like there are lots of players of his ability around for Wales to draw upon. And it is difficult, I think, not to think or not to ask the question whether race had a role because it's not like his name ever comes into the frame again, or at least in the public sense, for selection.
Nobody wanted to highlight a black player as being remarkable and being the first black player. That is remarkable, that is important, that could have been used as a tool to inspire other people to come and join. But the fact that he's a black player, people want to downplay that because, you didn't want to be seen to be promoting black people.
There is some mention in the English press simply saying this is the first, to use the language that they use, kind of coloured player to play in a home international. And they just note it as a kind of, a quirky fact. They're not making anything political. And in the Welsh press, they gloss over his race completely.
This is an example of what continues to happen to black people, where you're written out of history. And this is the work of Black history that we support. We're saying all these people, Eddie Parris, and people like him, are absolutely critical. We need to tell those stories. This is our history. So many black people have been written out of history, in the past. It's not just Eddie.
A 2021 report found that there were 13 monuments, buildings or street names in Wales commemorating people who took part in the African slave trade. Recently, it seems there's been a greater effort to recognise black history. Also in 2021, a statue dedicated to head teacher Betty Campbell by sculptor Eve Shepherd was unveiled in Cardiff. In the same year, Professor Charlotte Williams published her report on black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, contributions and Cynefin in the new curriculum in Wales. In Chepstow, Armand has been lobbying for a monument of Eddie.
And you mentioned the Black Lives Matter campaigns and protests.
Yeah.
It strikes me a lot of people have been thinking more about the black presence in Wales.
Absolutely.
How that has often been understated and ignored in history teaching, etc.
Yeah.
Do you think there's something about this moment that has sort of brought to the fore the idea of memorialising Eddie?
Yeah, I think so. I've got children in school locally, and I think even the schools themselves have had to kind of really think about the, issues of equality, about, racism in school, racism in the community, racism in society, and then, having debates around that. So everybody's switched on. I have to kind of catch myself with the children. They know more about it than I do now, So, it's a good thing. It's a positive thing, and that's the way that society should be going.
And how is the statue campaign coming on?
Well, it's been slow. It's not. There's been interest when it's had media interest, whether it's the BBC, the Western Mail, but certainly since the Black Lives Matter movement has come to the fore, people have been more switched on to that. So I think there's more currency in the argument of trying to get some permanent fixture, whether it's a statue or a bust of Eddie, really, whether that's in town, or whether that's at Chepstow football ground. Or even at the castle. I think Eddie deserves some recognition, really, for that achievement, really, for the people that he represents, and for the people of Chepstow, who I say are really proud of that.
Do you know what? Last night I saw the one show and it had Liverpool, where they had painted murals on walls. Wouldn't it be great to see a mural of Eddie Parris on a wall in Chepstow? That would be really good.
Yeah.
That's what I would like. I don't know, statues, they're cold and hard, but I think paintings bring people to life a lot more, and I think that would be much, much more appropriate.
Should have had a massive monumental piece somewhere saying, here is your first black player. Where is all that celebration and sense of joy? This was what people like Patty Flynn, like Betty Campbell, kept on saying, that we're all written out of history. It's not just in this particular case for football, but across all areas of achievement in Wales. This is why we protest, and this is why we stand together to say Black history must be taught in school. His name should never be forgotten by any child who's born in Wales. He played for Wales. So let them be remembered along with their white counterparts.
History is complicated and history works in different ways. I think, from the context of the 1930s, Eddie Parris isn't all that important, really. You know, it's not like he's a famous name. It's not like, you know, his selection for Wales causes a big discussion or debate about race, you know, or at least it doesn't in a public context. Unfortunately, you know, a lot of the rhetoric around race is based upon an idea that it's something recent, and that's simply not true. You know, there are black people in Britain going back hundreds and hundreds of years, and Eddie Parris is a reminder of that. So I think, you know, it is important to remember him because it is a challenge to this idea that, you know, diversity is something recent. He challenges this idea that Wales is a white country, and that in itself is really, really important.
There's a long tradition of celebrating pioneers in football, but the recent calls to memorialise Eddie Parris aren't just about acknowledging his one cap for Wales back in 1931. It's also about making a clear statement that Wales today is a place that values its diverse history.
It would be almost 50 years before another black man would be selected to represent Wales. In episode 2, I'll be meeting George Berry to talk about the highs and lows of being a black footballer in the 70s and 80s, classic kits, and becoming a Welsh icon.
Tropic